When most Canadians think of World War II, they picture the beaches of Normandy, the skies over Britain, or the icy waters of the Atlantic. But there was another battlefield, hidden in plain sight, one not marked by bombs or bullets, but by barbed wire and silent suffering. It stretched across the vast landscapes of British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec. This was a battlefield of fear, suspicion, and injustice, the internment camps of Canada. As the war raged abroad, another kind of war was quietly unfolding at home. Thousands of men, women, and children, many of them born in Canada, were declared enemy aliens. Stripped of their rights, they were forcibly removed from their homes, herded into camps, and detained without trial. The government justified it in the name of national security, but history tells us this was something more. A story of xenophobia, racism, and betrayal. Of Canada turning against its own. The most well-known victims were Japanese Canadians. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, fear and hysteria swept through the Pacific coast. Despite there being no evidence of disloyalty, over 22,000 Japanese Canadians were forcibly relocated from British Columbia, their property seized, their freedom stolen. Families were torn apart. Children were dragged away from schools. Businesses shuttered overnight. What had been built over generations vanished in a matter of days. But Japanese Canadians weren't the only ones. Italians and Germans were also targeted. Roughly 31,000 Italian Canadians were labeled enemy aliens. About 600 were interned. Some were community leaders, others laborers or farmers. Their only crime? Having the wrong ancestry in the wrong time. German Canadians, including Mennonites, Jehovah's Witnesses, and political dissidents, also faced surveillance, suspicion, and internment. Even Jewish refugees fleeing Hitler were not immune from suspicion and imprisonment in enemy alien camps. The internment wasn't spontaneous chaos. It was systematic, it was planned, and it was endorsed by the state. The Canadian government passed the War Measures Act, giving itself sweeping powers to detain and dispossess anyone it deemed a threat. There were no trials, no charges, only silence. Behind the euphemistic term relocation lay the harsh reality of incarceration, forced labor, and cultural erasure. Perhaps what's most shocking is how few Canadians today know this happened. It's not in most school textbooks. There are no monuments as large as those for battlefield heroes. This wasn't a proud moment. It was a shameful one, buried under decades of silence. But history has a way of resurfacing. Survivors spoke out. Activists fought for recognition. And finally, in the late 20th century, Canada began to reckon with this hidden chapter of its wartime past. But how did this system work? Where were these camps located? What were the conditions like for the people trapped behind the fences? And why did so many Canadians, neighbors, co-workers, even friends, stand by as others were labeled threats and cast aside? From the outside, the internment camps appeared to be hastily built compounds, clusters of tar paper shacks, guard towers, and barbed wire fences. But from the inside, they were entire worlds, suffocating in control, yet quietly defiant in spirit. For the thousands detained by the Canadian government during World War II, these camps were not just prisons of wood and steel. They were places where identities were erased, hopes suppressed, and families fractured. The journey to internment often began with a knock at the door. Government officials, or RCMP officers, would arrive without warning, sometimes in the dead of night. Japanese Canadian families in Vancouver's Powell Street neighborhood were given as little as 24 hours to pack what they could carry. What they left behind, homes, businesses, fishing boats, family heirlooms, was seized and custodially managed by the Office of the Custodian of Enemy Property. Many would never see their possessions again. Once removed from the coast, Families were scattered across Canada. Some were sent to ghost towns in the British Columbia interior, like New Denver and Caslow, where makeshift housing awaited. Others were shipped east of the Rockies and placed in labor camps or sugar beet farms in Alberta and Manitoba. For single men, the destination was often worse. Roadwork camps along the Trans-Canada Highway, where bitter cold, meager food, and grueling labor became daily reality. The internment camps varied in conditions. Some were overcrowded shanty towns with communal outhouses and no running water. Others were better constructed, but still fenced off and heavily guarded. In many camps, families were divided. Men sent to one location, women and children to another. Letters were censored. Movement was restricted. Curfews were enforced. Identity cards had to be carried at all times. Surveillance was constant, and yet, within these confines, people built lives. Children played in the snow between barracks. Makeshift schools and churches were organized. Garden plots were dug into frozen ground. Art, poetry, and music emerged as ways to cope and resist erasure. In one of the darkest chapters of Canadian history, dignity persisted. Some detainees even created newspapers, mimeographed bulletins that documented camp life, mourned losses, and advocated for justice. For Italian and German Canadians, life varied. Most internees were men, held in camps like Petawawa in Ontario or Kananaskis in Alberta. They slept on straw mattresses in wooden bunkhouses, guarded by soldiers. Despite having lived in Canada for decades, some since before World War I, they were viewed through the lens of foreign suspicion. For many, the accusations were vague. Communist sympathizer, member of an Italian cultural club, wrote a letter in German. That was often enough. The psychological toll was immense. Many detainees suffered depression, anxiety, and long-term trauma. Children raised in the camps internalized a sense of shame, unable to understand why their parents were treated as enemies. Others emerged determined never to forget, or forgive, what had been done to them in the name of national security. But what made the internment especially cruel was the silence beyond the fences. In towns and cities across Canada, neighbors rarely spoke out. Fear, racism, and nationalism drowned out empathy. Newspapers fanned the flames of distrust. Political leaders, including then Prime Minister Mackenzie King, justified internment as necessary, even humane. Few questioned the injustice as it unfolded. Still, there were flickers of resistance. A handful of church leaders, journalists, and legal advocates spoke against the policy. Japanese Canadian leaders quietly organized petitions. Some fought to keep families together. Others refused to be relocated and were imprisoned. These quiet acts of defiance sowed the seeds for future reckoning. As the war dragged on, the question loomed. What would happen to the detainees when peace returned? Would they be allowed to return to their homes? Would their property be restored? Would the nation acknowledge its mistake? The guns fell silent in 1945, but for thousands of internees, peace never truly came. As the world celebrated the end of World War II, Japanese, German, and Italian Canadians waited for Canada's conscience to awaken. But what followed was not reconciliation. It was another cruel chapter of dispossession, displacement, and denial. The war was over, but their exile was not. For Japanese Canadians, the betrayal was especially severe. When the internment orders were lifted in 1945, many hoped to return home to British Columbia. But instead, the federal government issued a chilling directive. They must choose either to resettle east of the Rockies, away from the Pacific coast, or be deported to Japan, a country many had never even seen. The ultimatum was clear: disappear quietly into the interior or leave the country altogether. For over 4,000 Japanese Canadians, many born in Canada, the threat of deportation became reality. Entire families were loaded onto ships and sent to a devastated, war-torn Japan, stripped of citizenship, property, and belonging. Others scattered across Canada, trying to rebuild lives in places that viewed them with suspicion or outright hostility. Meanwhile, the homes, businesses, and belongings seized during internment had long been sold by the government, without consent, without compensation. Fishing boats auctioned off, farmland transferred to white settlers. Photographs, heirlooms, and cherished mementos lost forever. The promise that property would be held in trust was a lie. The office of the custodian had liquidated it all, generating over $11 million in sales. The families received almost nothing. For German and Italian Canadians, the end of the war brought swifter release, but not vindication. Internees were quietly discharged, often without explanation or apology. Their names remained stained in official files. Careers had been destroyed, families fractured, community trust shattered. The stigma of enemy alien lingered, even when the truth was that most had been detained on flimsy or non-existent evidence. The press offered little sympathy. Few Canadians knew or wanted to know what had happened behind the fences. Government reports downplayed the scope of internment. School curriculums omitted the subject. It was easier to forget than to confront what had been done. And so, for decades, the story of Canada's internment camps remained buried, spoken of only in whispers by survivors, passed down as warnings to future generations. But memory has a way of surfacing. By the 1970s and 80s, a new generation of Japanese Canadians, children and grandchildren of internees, began asking questions. They combed through archives, collected testimonies, and organized. Activists like Roy Miki, Art Miki, and Marika Omatsu emerged as leaders in the movement for redress. They argued that what happened during World War II was not just unfortunate, it was unconstitutional. It was racism enshrined in policy, a gross violation of human rights. The movement gained momentum, petitions were circulated, public awareness grew, survivors told their stories in documentaries, books, and speeches. Gradually, Canadians began to reckon with their past, but resistance from Ottawa was fierce. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau rejected the idea of an apology, insisting that a country doesn't rewrite history. That stance would soon change, but only after years of tireless advocacy, emotional testimonies, and political pressure. As the redress movement reached its peak in the late 1980s, the question became, would Canada finally admit the truth? Would it apologize for interning its own citizens, for destroying their lives, for selling their property? Would the nation confront this hidden chapter, or bury it once again? By the early 1980s, 4 decades had passed since the internment camps were shut down. But for thousands of Japanese Canadians, the scars remained raw, and justice remained elusive. The government's silence had lasted longer than the war itself. The question now was whether a country that claimed to be a global beacon of rights and democracy could finally come to terms with its own authoritarian past. The redress movement surged forward, galvanized by community leaders, artists, scholars, and lawyers. Japanese Canadians across the country formed the National Association of Japanese Canadians, a grassroots organization dedicated to seeking formal apology and compensation. Public hearings were held, documentaries were broadcast, and survivors, many now elderly, came forward with gut-wrenching stories of loss, betrayal, and perseverance. They spoke of the humiliation of being called enemy aliens, of living in chicken coops turned into shelters, of watching their parents' life savings vanish into government auctions, and of the deafening silence that followed. Decades of invisibility in their own homeland. By now, the broader Canadian public was beginning to listen. Media coverage turned sympathetic. Historians uncovered government documents proving what the internees had long claimed, that the internment had little to do with security and everything to do with racism. The threat posed by Japanese Canadians was fabricated. There had been no cases of espionage. The decision to intern them, to exile them from the West Coast, had been made before Pearl Harbor, driven by political lobbying and economic jealousy, not national defense. Still, many in Ottawa resisted the idea of redress. They feared setting a precedent. They argued the events were too far in the past. But the NAJC persisted, armed with the truth and a moral argument Canada could no longer ignore. In 1984, Brian Mulroney's progressive conservative government came to power, and after years of advocacy, there was finally a shift. Negotiations began between the federal government and the NAJC, but it was not an easy process. Initial offers were rejected. Survivors demanded not just money, but acknowledgement, a public apology, a statement that what had happened was wrong, unconstitutional, and should never happen again. Then, on September 22, 1988, a moment long overdue arrived. Standing before the House of Commons, Prime Minister Mulroney delivered an official apology to Japanese Canadians. He called the internment a great injustice, a violation of fundamental rights. He announced a compensation package, $21,000 to each surviving internee, the establishment of a $12 million community fund, and the expungement of criminal records for those who had resisted internment orders. The House fell silent. For many survivors, it was the first time they felt truly seen by their own government. The apology was not a cure, but it was a recognition of pain long denied. That same year, the U.S. government issued a similar apology to Japanese Americans. But while the American redress effort was spearheaded by legislative action, Canada's had been powered by grassroots resilience. It was, in many ways, a story of democracy in action, proof that ordinary people could challenge the state and win. Yet, even in victory, some wounds remained unhealed. The apology came too late for thousands who had already passed away. The compensation could never replace the homes lost, the years stolen, the trauma passed down. And other communities, Italian Canadians, German Canadians, Indigenous peoples, were still waiting for their own reckoning. And so the question echoed into the future. Could redress ever truly be enough? Or was it just the beginning of a deeper conversation about historical memory, systemic racism, and how nations confront their darkest chapters? In the quiet corners of British Columbia, remnants of internment camps still whisper their stories. Collapsed wooden barracks overtaken by moss, rusted nails buried in the soil, and fading photographs tucked into family albums. They are not monuments, but scars. Reminders that democracy, even in a nation as peaceful as Canada, is not immune to fear and prejudice. The official apology and compensation delivered in 1988 marked a critical step in Canada's reckoning with the internment of Japanese Canadians. But history is not only about what happened, it's about what we choose to remember and how we let it shape our future. In schools across Canada today, the internment camps are finally part of the national curriculum. Students read about how over 22,000 citizens, most of them born in Canada, were labeled enemy aliens, not for anything they did, but for who they were. Teachers challenge young minds to consider how quickly rights can vanish when fear takes the driver's seat. For many students, these lessons prompt a deeper question. If it happened once, could it happen again? That question became urgent after September 11th, when national security once again took precedence over civil liberties. Muslim Canadians found themselves facing surveillance, racial profiling, and unjust detainment. The echoes of the 1940s were chillingly familiar. Activists and legal scholars began drawing direct lines from the internment of Japanese Canadians to the treatment of Muslim and Arab communities in the early 2000s. Canada, it seemed, had not fully absorbed the lessons of its past. In 2006, the government passed the no-fly list, known as the Passenger Protect Program. Critics warned it could replicate the errors of the internment era, targeting people based on vague criteria and secret evidence. Others pointed out that once again, marginalized communities bore the burden of national paranoia. But this time, the resistance came faster and louder. Legal challenges were filed. Civil rights groups mobilized. Survivors of the Japanese-Canadian internment lent their voices to the cause, reminding the public of what happens when governments abandon due process. Their lived experience became a moral compass in times of crisis. In recent years, Canada has taken cautious steps toward broader redress. In 2021, the government formally apologized to Italian Canadians for their internment during WWII. There are growing calls for a national memorial to all civilian internees, not just as a remembrance, but as a warning to future generations. Culturally, the story of the internment has made its way into literature, film, and visual art. From Joy Kogawa's powerful novel Oba-san to Nisei artists depicting life behind barbed wire, Japanese Canadians have turned trauma into testimony. Their work demands not just remembrance, but reflection. Perhaps most powerful of all is the intergenerational dialogue now taking place. Younger Japanese Canadians, many of whom never experienced the camps directly, are reclaiming their history, asking grandparents to share what they once buried in silence. They are transforming memory into activism, honoring their ancestors by fighting for justice in the present. So what is the legacy of Canada's WWII internment camps? It is a lesson written in the language of loss and resistance. It is a testament to the fragility of rights and the strength of those who defend them. It reminds us that democracy is not self-sustaining. It must be guarded, especially in moments of fear. And it proves that even when the state fails, the people, through courage, persistence, and truth, can force a nation to confront itself. As we end this journey into one of Canada's darkest chapters, we are left with a challenge, not just to remember the injustice, but to prevent its repetition. Because history, if ignored, does not remain history. It becomes prophecy. And in a world where fear is still a powerful currency, the story of the internment camps is not just Canadian history. It's a warning to all of us.